Hello, everybody, and welcome to our statewide Sociology 111 synchronous session. Today, we are going to be covering Chapter 12, which is Gender Stratification, and Chapter 13, which is Age Stratification. We'll begin, of course, with stratification by gender, Chapter 12. Some of the things we're going to take a look at: the idea of the social construction of gender, sociological perspectives on gender, women as the oppressed majority and the reason why we call them the oppressed majority. We'll look kind of at women in the workforce of the United States of America, and the emergence of what will be called a collective consciousness by Durkheim. Some of the questions we'll be addressing: what are the accepted gender roles in today's society? Have men and women's positions in society changed? And how do gender roles differ from one culture or subculture to another? Okay, beginning with the idea of the social construction of gender. When we talk about gender roles, what we're talking about are expectations regarding behavior, attitudes, and activities of males and females that people consider proper. How do we expect people who are identified as male or female biologically, which refers to the sex, how do we expect them to behave? What do we consider appropriate behavior? And that's gender roles. And gender roles are the social expectations regarding being born one sex or another. Of course, one of the things we must understand is that the idea of gender is not a strict dichotomy. We do not act specifically male or female, displaying specifically masculine or feminine qualities. It's more like a spectrum of behavior, and people will fall at various points along that spectrum. Behavior is constructed socially. And what that means, of course, is that we reproduce gender through interaction. Each time we act in a certain way, we are recreating and reproducing gender expectations in society. So what this is it shows up in all sorts of different settings. Here on the slide it says, of course, work and behavior and how we react to others. We have gender expectations with regards to dating situations, with regards to family life, and these are all kind of socially constructed and reproduced between generations. So, when we are socialized, if you remember back to the chapter on socialization, it talks about the development of individual personality traits and individual behavior. We are socialized into correct gender role behavior when we are going in the initial stages of the process of socialization. Boys must be masculine, girls must be feminine. So boys are expected to be active, aggressive, tough, daring, dominant. Girls are expected to be soft, emotional, sweet, submissive. Any kids who exhibit gender opposite characteristics may be in some degree stigmatized by their peer group. There are social researchers who have done research on this, and they have found that with regards to appropriate gender behavior in kids and in preteens and teens, there is a lot of self-policing by the peer group going on. The peer group is very emphatic in its gender role expectations and will go to great lengths to maintain appropriate gender role behavior in members of the peer group. Those who exhibit gender opposite behavior, as I said, will suffer stigmatization. One researcher, in fact, was looking into what she called, and winded up calling, the fag discourse. And she thought at first, because this was prevalent among boys, that they were calling each other gay. And when she looked deeper into it, what she found was that calling someone a fag in that context was more about their gender behavior and not about their sexual orientation. Whether you were heterosexual or homosexual, kids essentially said, that's not what we're, that's not what we're looking at. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, she found, was specifically appropriate gendered behavior. And one of the things, of course, the root of that, the idea of the fag discourse, that she discovered, even though it wasn't necessarily about sexual orientation, it has its roots in the idea that sexual orientation can determine inappropriate gendered behavior. But that's more a function of our society's homophobia than it's a function of actual gendered behavior. When we talk about homophobia in our society, men are very restricted in any kind of expressive behaviors they may exhibit. A man who frequently gets emotional, tearing up at movies, in family situations, watching the news, may be somewhat stigmatized simply because our society has had a degree of homophobia in it. And oftentimes the association of feminine gender characteristics are associated with homosexual behavior. When we look at homophobia, when we look at gender role behavior, especially for men, adults, older siblings, mass media, religious institutions, and educational institutions also can exert important influence in that these institutions and individuals may help to shape the peer group's ideas on appropriate gender behavior. Of course, the first socializing agent people encounter, for the most part, will be their parents. First and most crucial agents of socialization. This can be important with regards to homophobia because parents may instill those values in children. Oftentimes our earliest socialization is the socialization that has the strongest effect on us. Okay. When we think about gender roles, men's and women's gender roles, women's gender roles in the United States of America, there is an expectation of women being nurturing, caring, and essentially they're going to be the ones that are expected to be the primary caregivers to children. They're going to be responsible for the expressive tasks within the family, the tasks of taking care of the children emotionally, and then the full-time caregivers as well. This extends even into education. If we look at some of the educational ideas that have been promoted over the past, for example, what type of college degree would women be encouraged to pursue if we look back into the 40s and 50s? When I ask this, a lot of times some of the responses I get are, well, maybe they were encouraged to pursue administrative, like so they could be a secretary, or nursing, or teaching. The truth is, the most prevalent degree among women in college in the 40s and 50s would have been home economics, because the idea there is what women are there in college to do is to meet a husband, and what they need preparation in is being ready to take care of the home. So the separation of the public from the private sphere that accompanied the Industrial Revolution led to women having far more restrictions placed upon them than men. In an agrarian society, both parents are responsible for both the instrumental and expressive tasks within the household. Both parents are expected to contribute to the economic production of the household, and both parents were expected to participate in child care as well. Colonial times, men were much more involved in child rearing and child care than they were during the 1950s at the height of the industrial society in the United States of America. When the public and private spheres were combined, essentially the home was also the economic center as well as the familial center of the family. As you separated them, work moved out of the home. Women were the ones that were relegated into the private sphere. Men were free to pursue work in the public sphere. So, we are seeing change right now in the traditional gendered characteristics of who's the primary caregiver for children. There are changes in attitudes towards parenting. Men are expected to be more actively involved in child care. So there may be more changing in like the behavior. But when we think about what men are supposed to act like, well, when I say behavior, what I'm referring to there is, of course, they're expected to be more involved in parenting the children, but they're still expected to exhibit traditional male gendered characteristics. Logical, cold, reserved, rational, not really expressive. So men grow up with an inability, what develops into an inability to really express themselves emotionally, and an inability to share feelings because that's the way they've kind of been socialized. Boys don't cry, right? Boys tough it out, you know. Boys really don't express feelings. And so boys who adapt to the cultural standards that exist oftentimes have trouble really showing how much they care. That is changing somewhat. When we talk about multiple masculinities, it's the idea that a male gendered role can have variety within it. And being expressive is not necessarily a non-male gendered role. The traditional male gendered role, being expressive, is not a part of that. But increasingly, we're seeing a tolerance for multiple masculinities. This may somewhat accompany the reality of the fact that right now we're seeing an increasing prevalence of stay-at-home dads, fathers who are choosing for whatever reason, and mothers who are choosing for whatever reason to reverse the traditional roles there where the father is staying home as the primary caregiver and the mother is the one that's going out and making the money, providing for the family. So we're seeing a reversal in instrumental and expressive tasks within the family unit. So, when we talk about human sexuality, sexuality itself is really kind of how we express our sex and our gender in a certain sense. Sexuality has to do with what we're attracted to, our sexual orientation, behaviors and when we're engaged in sexual activity. But when we think about kind of gender roles, there have been labels that derive from definite gender role distinctions between the genders. Some of the labels, you know, that we might have heard from the past century are changing. The idea of bromance and metrosexual are two things we've seen in recent decades that indicate how gender roles have changed and are becoming more ambiguous, because, you know, a bromance is the idea that we meet somebody as a male that is male, but without a sexual overtone to it. We are very interested in that person and want to spend a lot of time with that person, getting to know that person. And so bromance is kind of a platonic love between men. Metrosexual is the idea that men can be more expressive, more caring, also more concerned with personal hygiene and personal appearance without appearing to be exhibiting feminine gender characteristics. Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, of course, was the television show that brought metrosexual into the national lexicon and really promoted the idea that even straight men can be concerned with things like the layout of an apartment, the artwork that's on the wall, cuisine, all these kind of things. So we're seeing some changes going on. Margaret Mead is one of the anthropologists who has looked at gendered differences across cultures, how gender is constructed differently. When she was studying the populations, the peoples of New Guinea, she discovered some interesting things there. One of the things she discovered in one tribe, gender roles were actually reversed. What we would consider feminine behavior was masculine behavior for this tribe, and what we would consider masculine behavior was feminine behavior in this tribe. Another tribe, the behaviors exhibited by both sexes would have been considered feminine by our perspective. So both gendered roles would have been considered feminine gender roles from the cultural perspective of the United States of America. And then still a third tribe, she found gendered roles where both male and female gendered roles would have been considered masculine from our perspective here in the United States. So there's a lot of difference in the way that gender is constructed, which really is what offers support for the idea that gendered roles are socially constructed roles. So when we talk about gendered stratification, one of the first things that you have to look at is how people are socialized into gender roles. Individual socialization, if you grew up in a household where dad went out and worked and mom stayed home, cooked, cleaned, took care of the children, your socialization is going to be into those traditional gender roles within the family. If, however, you grow up in a society where that's not the expectation, your individual socialization will be into whatever traditional gendered roles exist in the family you grow up in. And then there's kind of repetition of this, promotion and support of traditional roles by other social institutions. In education in the 50s, for example, boys took shop class, girls took home economics in high school, and there was no crossing over. If you were a boy who wanted to take home economics, it wouldn't have resulted in stigmatization in the 50s because you wouldn't have been allowed to do it. They would have said, no, only women are supposed to take those classes. So we see here support of traditional gendered roles by other social institutions. Within the media, if you're watching Leave It to Beaver every night, if you're watching The Brady Bunch, if you're watching, any of the shows that you can think of that have a traditional family unit where you have male and female and children, mother, father, children, the roles were pretty traditional in there, in that the father was the one that went out and worked, the mother was the one that was expected to stay home and take care of the children. So media as a social institution promotes and supports traditional gender roles as well. All right, moving on to our sociological perspectives on gender, beginning with the functionalist view. The idea of gender in and of itself and gender differentiation actually contributes to overall social stability, in that within the family, if we have stratification by gender and men are expected to take care of the instrumental tasks, women are expected to take care of the expressive tasks, and we have these gender role behaviors that are kind of idealized in the traditional family view, This contributes to the overall stability of society simply because both the emotional and the instrumental needs of children are taken care of within the family unit. Instrumentality, well, when they say express emphasis on task, what that really means is the task of providing for the family, the task of making sure that the family has food, shelter, clothing, has the resources it needs. The mother may be the one doing the shopping, but the father is the one, in the functionalist view, that goes out and earns the money to make the shopping possible. So the task itself is provided for by the father working. The expressiveness, of course, that is when we look at the harmony and internal emotional affairs of the family, and the expressive tasks are considered in traditional functionalist view to be the purview of females. So, the division of labor that exists within the household contributes to the overall stability of the family unit, and therefore contributes to overall social stability, in that the new members of society are provided for both instrumentally and expressively within the family unit. Because family is the social institution that provides new members of society. We do not live in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where we have children produced in factories. Now, conflict takes a different view. Conflict says, in a patriarchal society, it is the dominant gender, men, that benefit from the free labor of the subordinate gender, women. So the functionalist approach, essentially by saying, well, this is good because it provides for everything, it masks the unequal distribution of power as a resource in the family unit. The relationship between males and females is one of inequality with regards to social, economic, and political power. This continues to be true to this day from the conflict perspective. If we look at the makeup of Congress, if we look at the makeup of the Fortune 500 companies, when we talk about media and, with regards to what is promoted within media, we still see a lot of kind of ideas of traditional gendered roles. Overwhelmingly, men control the economy. They tend to be on the boards of directors and executives, high-level executives in the top money-making companies. They make up the majority of politics, the political system. If you look at the makeup of Congress, the executive, and the judicial, you will see that it is overwhelmingly male. And so conflict essentially says women are subjugated in society to benefit men. Men are the ones that benefit from the subjugation of women. Feminist perspective really comes out of the conflict tradition itself. Frederick Engels, who did a lot of work with Karl Marx, was one of the first feminist thinkers. And he kind of talks about how the arisal of private property, where property was owned, coincides with the beginnings of the real subjugation of women, because women were relegated, as I said, to the private sphere. Men were in the public sphere. It was in the public sphere that who owned property was determined, and where economic power allowed people to purchase property. Contemporary feminist theorists really kind of look at subordination as part of an injustice that really is inherent in capitalism itself. Capitalism, from a conflict and feminist perspective, is the type of economic system you really need to have that works best in conjunction with industrialization. So contemporary feminists essentially say capitalism exists as a reflection of patriarchal domination of society. So, the idea of the matrix of domination, or what can also be called intersection theory, says that the more subordinate statuses you have, class-based statuses, gender-based statuses, even race and ethnicity-based statuses, the more minority you have, the more social forces converge to create subordinate status, and it creates kind of a cumulative impact. So when we look at the matrix of domination, if you are female, if you are poor, and if you are a minority race or ethnicity, this creates a cumulative impact that really gives you an even more subordinate status than someone who only has one of those. Somebody who may be poor but is white and male, or maybe white but is poor and female, or may even just have just one of those statuses. This came out of the ideas of black feminists initially, African-American feminists initially, because they said we can't just look at the category of women as a monolithic, homogeneous category. We need to understand that within the idea of women, there's still individuality, so some women have more subordination than others, and some of what contributes to that additional subordination is race and ethnicity. Minority women are oppressed much more by race and ethnicity than they may be by gender. And so feminists may address the needs of minority women, but they really are still just addressing that as needs of women instead of needs of race and ethnicity as well. Okay, the interactionist approach, remember, is a micro-level approach, symbolic interaction, which is about the shared social context and the meanings people attach to symbols, to behaviors, to words, things like that. So when we perform traditionally masculine and feminine gender roles in society, we are doing gender, and we reinforce and recreate gender as a process. The interactionist perspective talks about gender as a process that is socially constructed and gets reproduced by people doing gender. And there's an continuing investigation of the idea of gender in cross-sex conversations, because a lot of times when you look at the interaction between males and females in conversations, males will tend to dominate it. Okay, sexism. Anytime you hear an ism, except maybe like feminism, which is kind of the anomaly there, but anytime you hear an ism, it's one group essentially thinking they're better than another group. Racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, ageism, classism. It's the ideology that one group is superior to another group. And with regards to sexism, it's the ideology that one sex is superior to the other. There may be people out there with sexist ideas that female is the superior sex to male. However, when we look at it from what would be called an institutional perspective, the sexism that exists in our society that has social power is the idea that men are better than women. Women get denied equal participation on the basis of gender at an institutional level. And when we talk about institutional discrimination, what we're talking about, institutional sexism, institutional racism, is the idea that people are not overtly putting their own personal beliefs into action. You don't have any overt discrimination going on, but all your outcomes are discriminatory. All your outcomes will be sexist. It's actually illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex for promotion, yet we still have a majority of supervisors are male in our society. Even in female-dominated occupations like nursing, you find a higher proportion of male supervisors than you do males in the general population of nurses. Nursing tends to have roughly 2 to 5% males working in it, the rest being 95 to 98% females. Yet, when we look at nursing supervisors and nursing directors, we see they're overrepresented because we see anywhere from 10 to 15, maybe even as high as 20% of nursing supervisors are male. That's institutionalized discrimination. However, of course, men suffer stress at higher levels, like hypertension and stress-related chronic illnesses, at higher levels than women. That may be because of greater participation in the workforce where there's more responsibility and stress. As we see more and more women entering the workforce and entering these high-level positions, for example, Mary Barra just became the CEO of GM recently, and she's had a very stressful first few months as CEO. So as women become more and more prevalent in high-level positions, not just in the workforce, but in the high-level positions that have power and responsibility, we may see more evidence of hypertension within women. Again, which may indicate that stress, chronic stress is not necessarily more related with being male, but more related with the position in which males find themselves. It's a positional or situational thing. Now, women are subordinated here in the United States of America, but if we look beyond our borders, we will find that women suffer far more in other nations than they do here. That's not justifying what goes on here. It's just a statement of the reality of the situation. In lower income agrarian nations, women tend to suffer much more from their second-class status. They are more likely to be denied equal pay, or the pay gap will be greater because, let's face it, the Fair Pay Act just stalled again in Congress and failed to pass, which is the piece of legislation mandating equal pay between men and women. They may be sexually harassed at work, and I'm not saying sexual harassment doesn't happen here, but women are supposed to have legal recourse to prevent sexual harassment here in the United States of America. The one thing, women cannot be dismissed from a job because of pregnancy here in the United States of America. That is illegal. Not saying it doesn't happen, and in a lot of places where you have what are called right-to-work laws, it will happen, but it's supposed to be illegal. Women are supposed to be granted time off in order to, and still have a job waiting for them when they come back because of pregnancy. In these lower income nations where women suffer more from the second class status, we're seeing more and more individuals and more social movements, collective movements of women mobilizing, trying to achieve equality in the same way that we saw that here in the United States of America following the Civil Rights Act. A lot of jobs that women hold, even in the U.S. society, are lower status jobs. And there's kind of a chicken egg argument with regards to that. Are the jobs occupied by women because they're lower status jobs and women are funneled into those jobs, or are the jobs dominated by women and then that causes the jobs to become lower status jobs? Nursing as an occupation has been around for hundreds of years, but when the AMA stepped in and professionalized the practice of medicine in the United States of America in the mid to late 19th century and started regulating it, why weren't nurses included in the category of people allowed to practice medicine? Why were they relegated to a lower status? It's because traditionally nursing had been a female dominated occupation. But if we look more broadly at a global perspective, we see that a lot of the exploiting work that would be considered exploitative work in developing nations, especially in the non-industrial sector, is performed by women. But we do see, like, even in, like, say, textiles, which has been industrialized in a lot of nations. They have factories where clothing is produced. That tends to be performed by women as well. In industrialized nations, women's unequal status is seen in the division of housework. Even in households where both partners agree that they split the work equally, women are doing on average 60% or more of the work. Women in our society do roughly 70 to 75% of the housework, even in dual income households. It's what's referred to as the second shift. And that's the 7.5 to 8 hour day of housework that a woman in a household where both parents are working or in a single parent household comes home to face, because 90% of the time when you have a single parent household, it's a woman heading the house and dealing with children. And so the second shift is primarily occupied by women. Okay, when we look at some of the numbers here, we see that 59% of adult women in the U.S. labor force now, compared to 41% in 1970. So we have seen an increase in that. The idea of the traditional family, though, the idea that women have historically stayed home and not worked, really, as the idea of the traditional family unit, is something that is distorted, because it really only happened for a brief period of time and was only available to upper and middle class families. For the most part, lower class households, you've had both parents working historically for centuries. So the idea of Ward and June Cleaver as the norm for families is a bit of a misnomer, because really that only existed for 30 years maybe in U.S. society where it was possible, and it was only available to the middle and upper class for the most part. If we look at current figures, most households, I want to say 60 to 65% of households where you have two parents are dual income households. Anyway, they are a larger part of the workforce now, and as I said, where it is possible for one parent to stay home, increasingly we're seeing men in the role of stay-at-home parent. Women are underrepresented in occupations historically defined as men's jobs. This is what's referred to as occupational segregation by gender, or occupational stratification by gender. Women often run into what's called the glass ceiling. They will be put into work tracks that have terminal positions. You can't advance beyond a certain position, and that's what's called the glass ceiling. It blocks promotion of qualified individuals, and the reason that these individuals were placed onto these particular work tracks were because of gender, race, or ethnicity. And it's accompanied by a phenomenon known as the glass wall. One of my students at one point in time was telling me about working at Walmart. The position from which you can advance to store manager or general manager is floor manager, floor supervisor. And women were not really put in that position. Women were put in the position of supervising, say, the floral department, or you know, becoming a certain department's supervisor instead of a floor supervisor. And those would be what would be called terminal positions. You could advance up to that supervisory position, but there was no way to get promoted up from there, and you couldn't even really move laterally into a floor supervisor position. She told me that the women in those positions were told, if you want to become a floor supervisor, you have to go back down and become a floor person and then work your way back up. So there's even glass walls blocking lateral movement in some cases. Compensation, gender gap. The figures on it, depending on what piece of research you're looking at, vary anywhere from 4 cents to 23 cents is about the highest I've heard. The average right now is women are earning about 80 cents for every dollar earned by men. Now, a lot of people will talk about, well, some of that is because women enter occupations that historically pay less. Well, with regards to that, when we talk about that, that may be true, but why do those occupations pay less? Why are doctors more valued than nurses when nurses are doing the majority of work in hospitals? And if we gave them the ability to do it, nurses could easily prescribe drugs because most of them are actually more familiar with seeing the effects of drugs on patients than doctors are. This is what I referred to as overrepresentation. It's also this last point here where it says males working in traditionally female-dominated occupations are encouraged to become administrators. That's a phenomenon referred to as the glass escalator, which is fast-tracking males into supervisory positions in female-dominated occupations over qualified females instead of qualified females. So, women are often asked to choose between advancement at a career or having a family. Men have never been asked to make this choice, but women have historically been asked to choose between having children and having a career that allows them to advance to the highest levels. If they choose to have a family, oftentimes they're placed on what's called the mommy track, which is a lower achieving track within a company. Women are still, as we discussed a little bit ago, still primarily doing the majority of the housework, so women face the challenge of juggling work and family. I mentioned this idea of the second shift, when women are working full-time and then they come home to a full day of work with childcare and housework. And a lot of times, because there's this assumption, because the second shift exists, women who have families are put onto lower achieving tracks. Okay. Feminism gets a bad rap. Usually when you hear feminism in the media, it's accompanied by either militant or radical. That's the smallest part of feminism there is. Social feminism itself, the idea of feminism, is not about turning society over. It's not about putting men into the subordinate position in society. Feminism is simply a belief in social, political, and economic equality between men and women. It was born in the U.S. in 1848, growing out of what was called the temperance movement, which was one of the earliest kind of feminist movements. And you may have heard the temperance movement was what led to eventually prohibition of alcohol, and that is true. Temperance was about, it's where teetotaler began as somebody who abstained from drinking alcohol. The reason that it was part of a feminist movement, though, was who suffered the ill effects of raging alcoholism amongst men. Men would get drunk, get violent, and go home and take it out on their families, on their wives. And so that's why the temperance movement was one of the first feminist movements, and the feminist movement actually grew out of the temperance movement. Second wave of feminism emerged in the 1960s. Well, that's skipping over a lot, because there was actually a wave of feminism that came along in the suffragist movement when women were fighting to get the vote in the early part of the 20th century. What's referred to as the second wave of feminism here was actually the third wave of feminism, which accompanied the civil rights movement and grew out of the civil rights movement when feminism came back out into the streets, came to full force in the 1970s, and culminated in the Equal Rights Amendment passing Congress, getting signed by the president, and almost becoming an actual amendment. It would have been the 28th Amendment. However, it only ever achieved 35 of the 38 states it needed to sign off on it to ratify it. But that wasn't the second. It was actually the third wave of feminism. The first wave of feminism was the temperance movement, which began roughly 1840, came into full being in the 1860s, late 1860s, 1870s, when a lot of soldiers from the Civil War were using alcohol to cope with what we would now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder. And so women were, at that time advocating for more regulation of alcohol. The second wave of feminism was the suffragist movement, where women came out advocating for the right to vote. And then the third wave was what's called the equal rights movement, which emerged in the 1960s and came to full force in 1970s. Women will agree with the positions of feminism, that women should be equal, but when you try to say, then, are you a feminist, a lot of times they don't want that label because of the negative media connotations of feminism, because of the negative stigma associated with being feminist, that all feminists are viewed as either radical or militant feminists, which is an unfair kind of stigmatization of that identity. All right, that concludes our discussion of Chapter 12, Stratification by Gender. We will be proceeding with Chapter 13, Stratification by Age. I'm just going to pause the recording here for a few seconds and wet my whistle. Go get a drink real quick. Okay, I'm back now. Stratification by Age, Chapter 13. Okay, some of the things we're going to be looking at in this chapter: aging and society, and looking at aging in the U.S. society. We'll be examining the sociological perspectives on aging. We'll take more of a global look at aging and see aging worldwide. And we'll look kind of at role transitions throughout the life course. And finally, culminate with looking at age stratification in the United States of America. Some of the questions we'll be addressing: how do people's roles change as they age? What are the social implications of growing number of elderly in the U.S., a phenomenon that is referred to as the graying of America? And how does ageism affect an older person's employment opportunities? The perception that you are older. In the Civil Rights Act, it's actually included that it is illegal, or it was amended to include that it is illegal to discriminate against somebody in hiring practices if they're on the basis of them being over 40 years of age. Okay, when we think about age stratification, 300 years ago, reaching 50 was considered old. But age stratification itself varies from culture to culture. In some ways, we can think of mandatory retirement as a form of legal discrimination on the basis of age. But all societies have some system of age stratification, associates certain social roles with distinct periods in life. Being old is a master status that overshadows all other statuses in the U.S. If you make it to old age, that becomes what defines you, more so than race, more so than ethnicity, more so than gender, more so than disability. Old becomes a master status. And barring tragic circumstances, this is the one minority status none of us get to escape. We're all going to be part of this minority group at some point in time or another. Old, as a designation, has stigma associated with it that determines how other people perceive individuals and how those individuals view themselves as well. How old is old? What do we mean when we say old? Some of the things we mean when we say old are someone who, no longer participates fully in society for some reason. It is a minority status in the United States, as I said, and it's the one minority status that, barring tragic circumstances, no one gets to escape. They suffer discrimination in employment. They share physical characteristics. Membership is involuntary. Once you're defined as old, it's externally applied. It's not like you say, okay, now I'm feeling old, so now I'll accept the label of old. No, that's something that may be applied before you're ready to accept it. There is a strong sense of group solidarity there. The AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, is what that acronym stands for. They just go by AARP now. Generally, when it tells its members to vote a certain way on an issue, they achieve rates of 80 to 90% compliance, indicating that strong sense of group solidarity. In general, you will see they're married to others of comparable age. We know that there are couples where there's a great deal of age between them, but that is not the norm. The norm is that we marry people who are roughly the same age as us. It's what's called homogamy. We tend to marry people who are very much like us in general. And age is one of the things that, because it gives you a shared cultural reference period, a shared experience. You've gone through certain experiences at certain points in your life, because there are what we would call kind of rites of passage in our society that are determined by age. Driving, voting, smoking, serving in the military, drinking, and then as we get older, of course, being eligible to join the AARP, being eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and mandatory retirement. So there are no clear-cut definitions. We use some definitions. In general, there's infancy, childhood, preteen, teen, early adult, adult, late adult, or middle age, and then old age, and then extreme old age. Old age typically begins at 65 now. That is much later than it used to begin. And there are two different types of old age now. The first one begins somewhere between 60 and 65. The second one begins somewhere around 80, 85. So, as I said, there are two distinct periods of old age now. There's the young old age and the old age. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that life expectancy in the U.S. extends out, is extending out to roughly 72 years of age, and depending on class, that may be even longer. In gender, women tend to live an average of 5 years longer than men. People from the upper class tend to live an average of 7 years longer than people from the lower class. Within sociology and other social sciences like psychology, gerontology is the fastest growing sub-discipline. And it's essentially the scientific study of sociological and psychological aspects of aging and the problems that the age experience. And it's one of the fastest growing areas. If you decide to be a psychologist or a sociologist, if you want to be guaranteed employment, go into the field of gerontology. Okay, we have a couple of theoretical approaches, a functionalist approach, a couple of theoretical approaches that are specifically named, one out of the functionalist perspective, one out of the interactionist perspective, and then we also have the conflict perspective on aging. Disengagement theory says that for the benefit of society, essentially, society and aging individuals mutually sever many of their relationships. The approach of death forces people to drop most social roles. The idea of mandatory retirement is to ensure social stability, because somebody dying does not leave a vacuum in the economy. Those positions have already been filled. Today, a lot of elderly people do wind up getting involved in volunteerism, post-retirement employment, and social connected, like social community centers, essentially. A lot of elderly people, post-retirement employment is not necessarily something that every elderly person wants to do. It becomes necessary for them to do in a certain sense. But the idea behind disengagement theory is that this provides the elderly with a period of life where they are free to engage in volunteerism. They are free to, which benefits society. They are free to establish greater connectivity with the family because they have the time to do that. Okay, activity theory essentially says that if you want to have a good adjustment in your retirement period, stay more socially involved. Elderly persons who remain active and socially involved are best adjusted. And this is, of course, the interactionist approach, because it's looking at the effects of staying socially involved on individuals. And it's saying that individuals that do that have better adjustment to retirement. If you are involved and you have interaction with people on a regular basis, this actually lowers mortality. Just because a person retires doesn't mean they're going to be happy staying at home, you know, and not interacting with people. We as a species are wired to crave social interaction. We need it. In fact, when we get to the chapter on health and medicine, we'll talk about this, but the World Health Organization's definition says that people are healthy if they are physically, emotionally, and socially healthy. Mentally and socially healthy. Mental, emotional are interchangeable terms, but the World Health Organization's definition of health includes a social component. It says we need to be socially healthy to be considered healthy. And, you know, feeling useful and productive and feeling like you're valued by the individuals around you is part of our social health. Another interactionist approach is the idea of labeling theory. Remember, we've encountered labeling theory before. This is when society reacts to the status of a particular person. We encountered labeling theory in the chapter on crime and deviance, and it was not necessarily the act itself. It was how society reacted to that act. In this case, labeling theory looks at how society reacts to people who have been labeled old. Society defines what it means to be old. What makes a person old? Is it just simple life expectancy, or is there a quality of life in there too? Why do we call it young old? Because people at 60, 65 are a lot more active now because of increases in health and technology. They are a lot more active now than they were 100 years ago. So it's not just how long one can be expected to live, but how long one can be expected to have a good quality of life. Labeling theory, you know, it kind of says old age should begin to last 10 to 15 years of a person's expected life. So right now, that's no longer strictly 60, you know, it used to be 50 and then you would live until you're 65. Now you could say with some degree of truth, people aren't getting old until they're 75, 70, 75, because more and more people are living until they're, you know, 85, 90 years of age. Look at Betty White. And I know that it's tragic. She just passed, but she passed peacefully. And she was well over 90 years of age when she did it. And we should continue to expect, as medicine improves, to see a lengthening of lifespan to the point where, you know, people might be expected to live over 100 years. So 50 would then be middle-aged instead of 35 to 40. labeling of old age, it differs culturally as well. What's considered old? Some cultures, if you're still able to go out and produce, you're not labeled as old yet. Finally, we get to conflict approach. Elderly are victimized by the social structure. They still have kind of the same social roles, but their status in those roles is devalued. Treatment of older people reflects many divisions in society. Well, what that means is when we look at marketing, when we look at media products, when we look at fashion, when we look at music, when we look at all kinds of things, they're geared toward 18 to 49. They are not geared towards older people. The transition from agricultural economies to industrialization and capitalism is not always beneficial to the elderly. It may provide for a better quality of life. It may provide for a better lifestyle. But because factory work has a limited number of positions and positions in an industrial society, because you have lengthening of lifespan, what you see is that mandatory retirement becomes a policy in an industrial society in order to reduce competition for jobs. That's part of that functionalist approach. But conflict says that this is unfair to the elderly because it's treating them all as part of a group instead of individuals. Further, a lot of times in agrarian societies, you see that the wisdom accumulated by elderly people will be valued. And so the elderly are valued because they've managed to live so long. That begins to reduce in an industrial society. A lot of the wisdom that the elderly may have is no longer of particular value. So when we talk about role transition or stages of life, we're really general terms. Midlife crisis, this was one of Erik Erikson's 8 life stages. And when we look at these ideas of role transitions, we're really building on the work of Erikson when we think about this. Midlife crisis is essentially when people realize, hey, there is more behind me than there is in front of me, and I have not lived a life that has made a contribution. I have not lived a life of consequence. So we see a lot of behaviors where people appear to be trying to act younger than their age. I'm not really this old yet. Look at me. I'm dating a younger person. Look at my hair. I've dyed it and I'm wearing it differently. Look at my clothes. Look at my car. These are all evidences that I'm younger than I'm supposed to be. The sandwich generation. This refers to an increasing phenomenon, which is situational poverty amongst the elderly. It's from people living on a fixed income, and that income may have been enough to provide for their needs, but inflation has taken it to the point where it can no longer do so. And so the sandwich generation refers to the phenomenon where parents who are grandparents are having to move in with their children, their adult children, and the sandwich, of course, is parents caring for children and adults who are caring for children and their parents simultaneously. We see stratification by gender in the application of this. Oftentimes, the parents will not be, regardless of whose parents they are, will not be so much cared for by the male. They'll be cared for more by the female, even if it's the male's parents living in the household. So when we talk about the last transition in life course, when we go from really kind of late adulthood into old age, roughly 65 right now, but it causes dramatic changes. You know, you may be forced into retirement at that age. And when you have to go into retirement, that is a rite of passage. Rites of passage, of course, defined by Atchley, critical transition from one phase of a person's life to another. Most of our rites of passage happen up until we turn 21. One that may happen after that, of course, is graduation from college, which is a rite of passage that really marks the end of a person's period of not really being responsible, and the beginning of a period when they're really expected to accept adult responsibilities. But that particular stage may happen earlier for people who don't go to college. But the final rite of passage for many people in our society is retirement. In the pre-retirement phase, people will spend an inordinate amount of time planning what they're going to do. And oftentimes these plans will be unrealistic. I'm going to spend so much time with my grandchildren. Unfortunately, by the time you get to retirement age, your grandchildren are entering early adulthood sometimes, and they become increasingly busy. And so a lot of the plans that are made in pre-retirement have to be revised. But from pre-retirement, you get into the near phase, which is when you begin to make certain financial adjustments. You may sell the house and move into a smaller house, or at least be preparing to do that. You may have your house listed. The honeymoon phase, that's that period where, wow, I've got all this time. And, you know, I'm going to go out and do all this stuff. And so you may see people sleeping, they may travel, they may enjoy it quite a bit. Following that, of course, is the disenchantment phase that I refer to when they find out, well, my grandchildren aren't nearly as available as I thought they'd be. I've traveled as much as I want to travel. So what do I do now? Now you have to reorient yourself. You have to figure out how you're actually going to deal with retirement. And usually this happens within, you're through these phases in about a 5-year period. And then you finally enter the period where you're kind of stable in what you're doing. Maybe you're into volunteerism. Maybe you've gone out and found a part-time job so that you can not necessarily provide for yourself. Some people have to do that because of situational poverty. But maybe it's just something that allows you to remain active. And finally, the termination phase, which is increasingly taking place in hospice arrangements. So, what we talk about, naturally occurring retirement communities. These are not planned retirement communities. Planned retirement communities, retirement homes, are something different. It's just certain areas where older Americans begin congregating that gradually become hubs for senior citizens. And it's because it's a gradual process through which this occurs. Sometimes you may see that happen in like shopping malls, because one of the things my grandfather used to love to do was walk around the shopping mall, just kind of seeing people, and he started seeing more and more older people doing that. They use it as a way to go out, you know, and get some exercise. They can walk around the shopping mall without worrying about what the weather's like. And so you have naturally occurring retirement communities. It may also have residential patterns where as a community kind of grows up, and children move away and get their own houses, but parents stay behind and retire and have paid for the house, you may see naturally occurring retirement communities as a function of a neighborhood growing up. But if a particular neighborhood that has grown up is selected for what they call gentrification, which is when you go in and try to revitalize a particular community that may be economically depressed for one reason or another, a lot of times the older residents aren't able to afford the new living conditions in these gentrified communities. So, Kubler-Ross was a researcher who really kind of looked at the death as a process. And she was a female. Open discussion of the process of dying, 5 stages of dying. Kind of challenged the idea of the process of dying. And she wanted to look at this. So when we look at functionalism, functionalists, dying fulfills social functions. Provides employment for some people, right? Hospice care. That's part of the huge demand for nursing right now, is in nurses to work in hospice care. And hospice care is really trying to provide a comfortable setting for a person to expire. It's either helping them to stay at home, and that can be fairly expensive. My grandfather provided hospice care for my grandmother, and it wiped out all of his savings, essentially. Because if you think about it, if you're going to have in-home hospice care, you're going to be paying for a nurse 24 hours a day, 3 shifts of nurses every day. And so you have to hire essentially 4 nurses because nobody wants to work 7 days a week. And so you need to have enough nursing to cover 21 shifts a week. And the way that my grandfather worked it out was they would alternate, kind of go through a rotation where they would be doing the morning, afternoon, evening, and there'd be somebody who'd kind of do 2 morning, 2 afternoon, 2 evening, filling in, and they'd get the extra shift doing that. And then they would, well, it was actually 2 first, mid, third shift, first, second, third shift. So it'd be morning, afternoon, overnight, afternoon and evening, and then overnight. And the person who did the 6 shifts would then go the following week onto the morning shift, allowing them, the day off would occur. So they'd have like almost, pretty much almost a full day off. They'd get off at 7 in the morning, have a full day off, and then start the following day. Anyway, that's just scheduling. But yeah, so hospice care, if you think about it, 21 shifts of nursing that you have to provide to stay at home. In a home-like setting, hospice centers are becoming increasingly common. And in these settings, it's not nearly as expensive as providing it for at-home care because you don't need to have 1 nurse per resident, in the way that, like, if you're going to provide hospice care for somebody at home, you're going to be paying for an in-house nurse. In a hospice center, nurse can handle several patients. You don't have nearly as much, you have a greater ratio of patients per nurse in that setting. People have broken through historic taboos about death. One of the ideas, as far as euthanasia, there's more and more of an open and frank discussion about that. And there's historically a religious taboo against euthanasia as a choice, assisted death as a choice. But we're beginning to see breakthroughs about that particular perspective, allowing euthanasia to become more and more openly discussed in our society. I mentioned this earlier, the idea of the graying of America. This refers to hair color, okay? And so what it's saying is that an increasing percentage of our population are going to be over 40 years of age, over 50 years of age, because we'll have fewer births, people living longer. So our society will be an aged society compared to what it is now. At the same time, the oldest old will grow at a faster rate because we'll be making breakthroughs in medicine that will allow extension of life expectancy and of quality of life. So the oldest old is going to be one of the fastest growing groups. Women outlive men. So in the oldest old, women are the larger group. They outnumber men by a ratio of 3 to 2. Women outnumber men in our society in general. That's why they're referred to as the oppressed majority. I think I might have forgotten to mention that in the last one, our discussion of the last chapter. But the idea of the oppressed majority is the idea that women constitute close to 51% of our population right now. There is a race and ethnicity factor that affects this as well. With greater access to health care and less economic depression, elderly are more likely to be white. Just a simple function of stratification and the correlation of race and ethnicity with poverty status. Of course, you see in Florida a higher proportion of older people, but if you look at the other states, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Iowa, West Virginia, and Arkansas, that's where we see the highest proportions of older people right now. The population of older people in Arizona fluctuates. A lot of people go down there seasonally. They will arrive in October, late October, early November, and they will stay until April. So you see a fluctuation in some of the southwestern states and some of the southwestern areas of an older population as they go down there to avoid the extreme cold, but then leave before the extreme heat sets in to those areas. Typically, there's a better standard of living for everybody in society, and so now typically an older person has a higher standard of living than in the past times. More and more people own their own private home. I want to say 69% of our society has accumulated wealth in the form of home ownership. We also have financial assets, private pensions, retirement plans, IRAs, things of this nature that are allowing people to accumulate greater amounts of wealth to allow them to enjoy a higher standard of living. Sometimes they may have to sell the house and move into more modest accommodations or get what's called a reverse mortgage, which is a mortgage that's actually set up to amortize negatively, where you accrue more and more debt in the mortgage, but this allows people to take the equity back out of their home at the end of their lives. Social Security, of course, under attack politically constantly, but Social Security has enough funds right now to remain solvent and pay out at least 3/4 of the benefits through 2075, roughly. But it provides 39% of the income received by older people, or 39% of all income received by older people. The correlation between poverty and minority status extends out through the life cycle. Groups more likely to be poor at earlier points in the life cycle are more likely to be poor at the end as well. Ageism. Ageism itself is another one of the isms. It's the idea that one age is better than another. Certain ages are disadvantaged because they're perceived as not beneficial or not as good as other ages. Being old equates being ill. So a lot of people stigmatize the elderly in the same way that people that suffer chronic illnesses, disabilities are stigmatized as well. shows like The Golden Girls are rarities on TV. When you reach a certain age and become part of the age category of old, you suffer minority status in that you don't see yourself widely represented in media anymore. You may have when you were younger, but as you age more and more, you do not see yourself represented in media anymore. That's not to say there aren't people aged on TV or in movies or things like that, but you do not see yourself as widely represented. And on TV, it's actually smaller than it is in movies. Not being afraid of aging, having positive perceptions on aging, actually can extend your life expectancy. We talked about gender-based effects. Women tend to live an average of 5 years longer than men. Class-based effects. Upper class tends to live an average of 7 years longer than the lower classes. White people tend to live an average of 5 to 7 years longer than minority groups members. And just then added to all this, of course, if you are willing to embrace aging and see it as a positive thing, that in and of itself can extend your life too. Now, from a functionalist perspective, mandatory retirement reduces competition for jobs in the economy. So mandatory retirement, while it may disadvantage particular individuals, actually benefits society overall by creating increased social stability. So older workers do face discrimination in the labor force. As I said, the Civil Rights Act was amended with the Federal Age Discrimination and Employment Act, which took effect in 1986, making it illegal to discriminate on the basis of age. And the courts have sided with elderly litigants. They've made significant decisions in favor of older workers. Okay, when we talk about the emergence of a collective consciousness, it's what Marx would have referred to as the emergence of a class consciousness, kind of. Durkheim had this idea of collective consciousness as the social values of an entire society. But when we talk about the emergence of a collective consciousness within the elderly, it's a growing recognition that they all face similar circumstances and that they also have power to do something about that, social power. AARP, as I mentioned, the American Association of Retired Persons is what that used to stand for. They have changed it to just AARP now. But because of a particular process, or because of particular forces within politics, the vote of an elderly person actually registers as greater because elderly people tend to turn out in the highest percentages. Usually somewhere around between 70 and 80%, maybe as high as 85% of people who are elderly turn out to vote in elections. That's why it is often political suicide to talk about privatizing Social Security and Medicare. You may hear that rhetoric periodically, but you will never see somebody, as long as things persist as they are in our society, elected to the office of president who campaigns on privatizing those. When Paul Ryan was selected to be Mitt Romney's running mate, he backed away from his stance on privatizing both of these because elderly people do not want anyone messing with Social Security and Medicare. So the AARP, and there's a National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. There's also Senior Action in a Gay Environment, looking at same-sex orientation amongst the elderly and advocating for the interests of those people. they do constitute a diverse group, but there are certain things that will unify them. As I said, any discussion of Social Security and Medicare privatization will receive kind of a unified voice decrying any action that way amongst the elderly. Okay, that concludes our PowerPoint lecture for today. We will be doing this again next week at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time, 1:30 Central Standard Time. And these are posted on YouTube as well. I hope to have some attendees next week. Everybody have a good week.